I know that a lot of you will be able to resonate with this podcast today because we're talking about what is happening in the brain in terms of what happens in perimenopause, menopause, what happens in the brain in women during diseases like Alzheimer's and dementia. And is it inevitable that so many of us will end up there? Are there things that we can do to prevent it? Dr. Sarah McKay is an Oxford educated neuroscientist, author, and science communicator. She specializes in translating brain science into practical insights for health, well-being, and women's life stages. Her best-selling book is called The Woman's Brain Book, and it explores how the female brain changes from puberty to menopause and beyond. So this is amazing because I've gone through a lot of those stages already, and I am very curious about the brain and what's going on. Sometimes I feel like the brain is just has a mind of its own, and it would be great to understand it a little bit better. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Sarah McKay. So welcome to the podcast. I'm so happy that you said yes to being a guest here today. And I would love to just start off with asking you this question. What moment in your life first made you curious about the female brain? Where did you go, okay, I
Oh,
think I'll be a neuroscientist?
well, I decided to be a neuroscientist and become curious about the brain decades before I started thinking about the female brain.
Okay.
So, first year university, I was living in still at home in Christchurch, New Zealand, at Canterbury University. That was in 1993, and it was a Psychology 101 lecture I was doing, and they were talking a little bit about the biology of psychology, so neuroscience, which was barely a discipline back then in the early
Yeah.
90s. And so that was the moment I was like, this is cool. And I changed universities to Otago University, also in New Zealand, because they had just started a degree in neuroscience, so bringing together the biology and the physiology and the pharmacology and the psychology of the brain. So that was a very precise moment in time, and I have not wavered from that interest. The women's brain health and the female brain, that had a much kind of later arrival, and that it was around, I wrote an article in 2015, so 10 years ago now. It almost feels like ancient history.
Yeah.
I was writing for the ABC here in Australia, which is like a national broadcasting channel, and I was writing kind of a brain blog. And we just had a list of like 20 or 30 different topics, and one of them was on menopause and brain fog, and is it a sign of Alzheimer's disease or dementia? And I'd never really written anything about this before, but I did the research, spoke to the experts, and wrote an article on that, and we posted it on Facebook, and it just went gangbusters, and we had
Wow.
thousands and thousands of shares and comments. And I was like, well, that's kind of
We've hit a
obviously people
nerve.
are interested. Well, I didn't, in my own mind, hadn't seen it as any different to any of the other topics I'd written about. But if you can still see that Facebook post now, and if you look through the comments, it's like
Okay,
looking back
yeah.
into the distant, distant past, because the
Mhm.
conversations are so different now. And the following year, I was then approached by a publisher saying, "Do you want to write a book?" And I was like, "No, it sounds like lots of work," but I kind of had my arm twisted. And the questions I was asked, two questions by she's now my literary agent, which makes me sound more important than I am, but hey, Jean. She said, "Oh, well, why don't you write a book about menopause if that article went gangbusters?" And I was like, "Well, that's like, I was 40 at the time. That's like stuff my mum does.
Mhm.
There's no research. I don't know. It just didn't seem relevant or interesting to me. I'm 50 now, so it's a little bit different."
Mhm.
And then she said, "Oh, what about baby brain? So what about pregnancy and motherhood?" And I was like, "Well, I don't know whether there's much data on that either, but oh my goodness, if we look across the female lifespan and look at neuroscience, maybe I can write a book looking at the female lifespan in neuroscience." And so we pretty much got a book deal straight away. And then I just was sort of catapulted into this world, this journey of taking all of my neuroscience skills and um, teaching and training and work that I had done, and then thinking about that through the lens of puberty and periods and pregnancy and the pill and anxiety, depression,
Mm.
menopause, aging. I just opened up this world
I
that,
bet.
to be fair, at the time there were a lot of gaps in the research 10 years ago.
Mhm.
And I'm fine with acknowledging the gaps. What has been mind blowing and exciting is to see how the gaps are recognized, and then now there is data starting to come in and fill those, and which is why I've now kind of wrote a second edition update of that first book.
Yeah.
So, and I can't, it's just, neuroscience is utterly fascinating. It's so broad and deep and rich, and it is so relevant to the female lifespan and so relevant to women's health.
I'm
So yeah, it's a
sure
good
some
place
of
to play.
our listeners will definitely look up that article that you wrote on Facebook, but let's dive into that. What did you find, and what did you say that was so exciting for people to look at and really identify with? Because it sounds like you really hit a nerve with the listeners and the readers, and they just finally went,
Mm,
wow, that's exactly what I'm experiencing. Tell me more,
yeah.
right? Yeah.
Bearing in mind that the menopause conversation now is wildly different to what it was then, and it wasn't really a topic of conversation on social media,
It wasn't at
not like it
all.
is
Yeah.
today. Not like it is today. It's now
Yeah.
like the hottest topic. Um, I think that the premise was brain fog is very common. Lots of women experience it, but it's not the sign of dementia. It is not the beginning of the inevitable decline towards Alzheimer's disease. It is to do with this kind of midlife collision of hormones and lifestyle and aging and the sort of the social world in which you live. I really always try to take a biopsychosocial approach, or what I call bottom up, outside in, top down approach, because the brain is considering information, sources of data, and making meaning of what is happening in our body in the context we're in, and then making meaning of that based on our prior experiences and future projections. And brain fog is no different. So it's this collision of all of these. It's almost like a perfect storm in some ways. The hormonal shifts of perimenopause and menopause being an enormous kind of place in which that is happening. But I think there was the reassurance that this isn't the beginning of the decline to dementia. And
Mhm.
perhaps at least that was the first time. I'm not saying I was the first person that said that, but that was the first time that lots of women had read that and had that reassurance.
Mhm.
And it just kind of blew open this kind of conversation that I haven't stopped having since.
It is really exciting to see how the conversation has evolved. Like right in the
Mm,
last 2 years, it's been
yeah, it's
just so
nuts.
loud. Yeah, it is,
Yeah.
which is great. Because
Mm.
yeah, it was probably very needed and interesting. Like there must be a huge population of women in menopause right now. Is that the reason why it's so, it must be touching a lot of us right now.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a perfect storm again of a lot of things. I think it's this Gen X women.
Yeah.
We're well educated, we're informed, we're not afraid to ask questions. I think there's the Gen X women mostly who, within the neuroscience space in particular, have made their way up the ranks and are now
Hmm.
at the point where they can ask the questions and start getting the answers um, to questions that weren't asked when it was, a less diverse cohort of researchers in the space. And we've seen that research starting to emerge. We've also seen globally, but driven by a lot of research organizations and kind of government kind of priority shifts, the recognition that there was gaps in women's health research, not just in neuroscience, but across the board. And I will say the recognition there were gaps, and then movements towards filling those gaps with research. And that's been really encouraging. And what I do try to do is, champion and highlight the work that is being done, not just moaning the fact that there's a gap, because I think that's a bit deficit focused. There's lots of work that is being done. Social media, there's just been all of these sort of shifts that have seemed to have come together at one time. This kind of moment in time
Mhm.
has just created like this kind of perfect storm, I suppose, for these conversations to begin. I will say that unfortunately, what we see, and we see this, we've seen this for the last sort of 10 or 15 years, largely due, I think, to social media and health, is when there are gaps and we don't always have a clear, straightforward answer. The data is mixed, which it so often is. If you're not happy with that uncertainty and it's hard to sit with uncertainty, then the gaps often get filled with kind of myths and hype and hope and
Mhm.
stories that aren't necessarily evidence-based. And that's therefore made a very, very noisy space where it's very hard for the cool, calm, clear messaging to get through. And often, unfortunately, where the science currently is and I can't tell you how many times I feel like I had to come up with a different way to say this in my book. The data is mixed. We're not entirely sure one way or another. We need to wait longer until we can make a clear kind of statement about what causes this or what treats that, or risks or benefits. It's very hard, but public health and science communications has been working in that space for a very long time. I just feel now there's a lot of noise, and
Mm.
what drives the social media algorithms isn't a cool,
Yeah.
calm,
Yeah.
clear-headed
Yeah.
description of data as mixed messaging. No one wants to hear that, right?
Yeah. I really got that from listening to lots of your content, is that you say that very regularly, that it will be different for everyone because the data is so mixed. And I
Mm.
think that's such a great message that I would like to help perpetuate as well. That it's because we do hear this on social, that it is all or nothing, that you have to do this or you shouldn't do that. You should
Yeah.
always do that. Like
Yeah,
anytime
yeah,
there's
yeah.
that
Yeah, yeah,
language
yeah.
and we hear that, we have to throw caution to the wind. Like we have
Yeah,
to
yeah,
be, mindful that
yeah,
it's,
yeah.
there's
And
more
the
study.
social media algorithm drives the
Well, for sure.
extremes, and it
I know.
drives the and it isn't going to drive. We should take a biopsychosocial approach and take our time. It's just not interesting or fun. But that's an interesting challenge as well, and that's not a new challenge when it comes to the kind of the world I emerge from, which is science and science communication and thoughtful medical and health communications. So it's not new. It's just a noisier space to be kind of hanging out in at the moment.
I would love to talk about that biopsychosocial approach because again, I heard you speak to lots of those things and I found that just
Mm,
really incredibly interesting. So let's talk about what is happening specifically to women in menopause because that's the majority of our audience. What is happening
mm.
first um, in our bodies? What's happening in our
Yeah,
brains, like
yeah,
the bio part
yeah.
of it? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I always think about the brain sitting in the middle of all of this. So it is in our body, but our bodies are embedded in this world. And so the brain is making meaning of the information that's coming from our bodies. And it's in this constant conversation. It's not just one way with our bodies. Many signals we're aware of, many we're not. Some people can tune in or out of, what those signals mean, and have a greater sort of sense of their body. But then there's this streams of data coming in through our senses, through what we see and hear and feel and touch and taste, including what information there's coming through the devices. Like there's a large stream of very loud information coming in, and our brain perceives that as being like right up close in front of us. It could be a war on the other side of the world, but it's live
Mm.
streaming in front of our face. So that's an incredibly important message that's coming in. And then we've got top down. And by top down, I mean, we could call that mind, we could call that psychology, we could call that past experiences and expectations and the meaning that the brain is making, the thoughts it's having, and then predictions about how to behave next. So if we just look at menopause, well, there's kind of two things to look at here. We've got perimenopause, the years leading up to the menopause, and then kind of after your last period, time beyond that, be calling that menopause. And biologically, menopause comes about essentially because your ovaries run out of eggs, and so they stop producing them, and your fertility goes into the decline. The sort of longer phase leading up to that final egg released, pop, out it goes. That's the last one, is this kind of ovarian brain conversation, which has been happening reasonably regularly and nicely for most of us from puberty through till now. And perhaps that was interrupted by pregnancy, or maybe you're on the oral contraceptive pill or some other contraception that stopped you ovulating. But there's been this kind of monthly, roughly, brain ovarian conversation, and then that conversation kind of goes a little haywire through the perimenopause. And that's caused by, as your eggs decline and you're not ovulating every month, your brain isn't receiving the same signals from your ovarian sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. And the brain's kind of almost going, I can't hear you this month. Make more, speak louder. And the ovaries go, okay. And then the next month there's a lot. And then the brain goes, dial it down, don't
No.
shout. And there's this kind of crazy conversation which stops and starts and roller
Mhm.
coasters. And it's that roller coastering of hormones, the super high highs and the low lows, which cause a lot of the symptoms that women experience. And then post menopause, of course, then it's pretty much flatlined. And if you're not taking any, menopause hormone therapy, then the conversation's kind of quietened, and other parts of your body may take over with the production of a few of these hormones, mostly different types of estrogen, but it's not at that cyclical conversation. Most of the symptoms, not all, but many of the symptoms that women experience then during perimenopause and in those first postmenopausal years are neurological, because the brain is kind of trying to make meaning of this conversation and then behaving in a way to try and modify and allocate its resources and brain and body to manage that. So the one that we understand most clearly is the role of that conversation in hot flashes or thermoregulation issues. And I think that it would be safe to say that based on our current understanding, a lot of the other symptoms we experience may be downstream of that, or at least there's a good biological mechanistic case to be say that they're downstream of that. So without wanting to talk for too long, we have a thermostat in our brain, in a part of our brain called the hypothalamus, which is like a normal thermostat. There's a hot and a cold sort of set levels in your body in which your physiology functions. And when you get too hot, your brain tells your body to behave in a way to dissipate heat. And it may also tell you to behave consciously in a way to dissipate heat. So you'll sweat, you'll vasodilate, you'll go red, you'll start like letting heat off. But if that doesn't quite work, then you might have to take your clothes off or turn the air conditioning on or put a fan on, or you will start to behave ways, no matter who you are at what age or sex, to cool down.
Right.
Now, when we're going through perimenopause, those levels get set. We typically talk about the bottom level coming down, but the top level dropping, but the bottom level can change a bit. So some women get extra cold as well. They're much more cold sensitive. And what happens then is if the top level's dropped, you only need a tiny shift in body temperature for your brain to perceive that as actual massive overheating. And then it sends this kind of emergency response to your body to behave in a way to cool down rapidly, and then to behave in ways, if particularly you're asleep, to then wake you up to cool down as well. So we've got a pretty clear biological, neurological understanding of that. And if you put hormones back in, we know that you can reset that thermostat and things typically tend to kind of even out in terms of thermoregulation. Downstream of that brain-body conversation potentially also includes some other symptoms that women experience. So we talk about brain fog. It may be that the changes in hormones are having a direct impact on neurons themselves in the brain in terms of their metabolism, their kind of energy expenditure. We see shifts in cellular energy expenditure with menopause, and it may be that the brain's just having to work harder to do what it does, or downstream to all that disrupted sleep that we experience with the hot flashes and the thermoregulation, that's inevitably going to cause brain fog. We also see that panic stations that the brain goes in to wake the body up involves this massive sympathetic activation. And if you've ever had a hot flash at night, you wake up often with you wake up with kind of this feeling of like adrenaline's gone through your body and into your legs. It's almost, you're not waking up slowly and gently, you wake up with quite a start, and that's that sympathetic activation going, wake up, wake up, wake up, a bit like with sleep apnea. And that, when you've got constant sympathetic activation without like any actual kind of threat out there, your brain has to start making meaning of, why am I hypervigilant? Why am I constantly kind of wired up? Even though I'm tired, you're tired but wired. And that can inevitably lead to anxiety, and that can lead to depression. So we've got like kind of these primary effects of the ovarian hormones in the brain and on neurons. And then we've got these secondary downstream effects that perhaps we've got this kind of clusters of symptoms coalesce and kind of trigger lots of different types of impacts on body and brain. And it's very hard to know what causes what, because as soon as you pull a lever, it changes a whole host of other things. It's very, very hard for us to make a clear case that A leads to, hormones lead to this, lead to this, lead to this, lead to this, because it's a complex body brain. So that's kind of, I've tried to be as concise, I'm not very good at it, to explain that body brain bottom up kind of phenomenon. But then of course we've got the outside in, and we've got, the top down. I touched a little bit there on the top down, the mind trying to make meaning of the body's state that it finds itself in.
Yeah. No, you explained that very well. That's very interesting. And there's also, you said that a social component that could impact everything that's going on. Could you speak to that?
100%. So we've got all of this information that's coming in to us, and we're receiving information from other people. A lot of information coming in from our
Yeah.
phones, and our brain is making meaning of all of that as well. And we know that any physiological state you find yourself in can be modified by the meaning your brain makes of that. And I think we tend to, so say we're receiving, we live in a really safe, socially supported, financially supportive, our lives this are well. We have great social well-being. We're in this kind of good place in life. It is easier for our body and our mind to then regulate versus say you were incredibly lonely, or you were socially isolated, or perhaps you were in a psychologically unsafe, socially threatening situation. Perhaps you're in a workplace where you're just incredibly unhappy, you're experiencing burnout. We have all of these outside in signals coming in, which are also challenging our brains and challenging our bodies. And they are also an input into this kind of overall physiological state we find ourselves in. So think about the kind of the most ideal social sort of environmental situation you could be in, and then the least ideal, and then kind of imagine how our body and brain is trying to, you know, work through that and regulate within that space. And so that's that also includes the information that we take in and the stories that we are telling ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of merges then with top down, which merges with like our top down mind now. So we have so any sort of emotion we feel, any experience we have in any moment in time is this combination of the ingredients from our bottom up body that our brain's trying to figure out, the outside in world, but our prior experiences. When I was last in this situation, what did it feel like? What meaning could be made of that? And how did I act? I'm in this situation this time. What does this mean? And how should I act next? What have I heard is important to behave and think and feel in this moment in time? What am I kind of looking out for, and what am I paying attention to? And I think that's not to say that symptoms are created by our mind, but they are also filtered through, and meaning is made of any experience we have. And we're pretty happy to accept that for lots of sort of mind body states. Say you have a you think, you think a sad, maybe you think about, maybe you've recently lost a parent and you have a thought in your mind about them. You will have a physiological response, and you may even start crying. And that's a mind body response, like just sadness. You
Mm-hmm.
might start thinking about an upcoming presentation, like, you've got to go and give a presentation to 1,000 people, in a theatre. And you'll start thinking about that, and you will immediately have maybe a physiological response in your gut. You'll start to physically feel nervous, and your tummy may even get upset. So we have a mind body response there. We know that if you say cut yourself, you get a paper cut in an office, right? You're sitting at your desk, it really hurts. But if you were like, an athlete playing a collision sport, you could have 1,000 paper cuts, the equivalent
Right.
of, and carry on and not even notice them. So our mind is incredibly powerful at prior experiences and our expectations in terms of the symptomology that we experience and what we tune into or have been told to tune into. And then that can have a feedback effect on our body and brain. So we can like hype ourselves up mentally so that a tiny little shift in our body state can feel like something to panic upon, or
Mm-hmm.
vice versa. We can use our mind to kind of calm ourselves down to, to lessen a kind of a brain response to a body state. So it's always going to be a combination of
Yeah.
these, but there's 1,000 of us, there's 1,000,000 of us, there's going to be 1,000,000 people with a different body
Different.
and a different world and different experiences
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
is going to be making meaning at any
Yeah.
moment in time. And that's why, my menopause isn't your menopause. What works for you some of the time won't work for everyone else all of the time. We need to accept variability and individual variation and not only focus in on the very, very best and the very, very worst. We're happy to do that at every other point in life. Currently, the menopause conversation is a little bit hyped, but I think it's having to be,
Yeah.
and it'll settle back down.
Yeah. It's like we need to get these things out, and then we need to, clear away the chaff, right? We
Yeah, the
need to
menopause
fine tune.
conversation is in perimenopause, or maybe
Yeah.
it's in puberty.
Yeah. What I
It's
love about,
like
yeah.
having its like crisis point.
Yeah.
And like for some of us it is a crisis, some of us it is based on our life experience up to this point, the situation we're in. It's not just that hormone fluctuation. And we've got evidence at other points in the lifespan because we tend to focus in on the hormones and blame the hormones. And hormones get a bad rap, whether the ovary brain conversation's kick-starting off in puberty, then we tell girls, you know, we're basically blaming the hormones for everything that goes wrong there. And even when they're sort of dialing up, and then when it's ticking along, we're focusing on, well, every month you're going to feel terrible because of your hormones. And then we're going through pregnancy and hormone levels are sky high, and we blame hormones for things like baby brain. We blame hormones when we withdraw from them from pregnancy, when they're roller coastering through perimenopause, and then after menopause, like we aren't having careful conversations about what hormones are doing, and so we're scapegoating them. And basically the message then, and I think this is part of the overall mismessaging, is if you have a female brain and body and you add hormones in, it automatically equals cognitive dysfunction and decline. It doesn't matter whether hormones are there or not. It's like we don't want them, or we do want them, or we want to top them up, or we want to dial them down.
Mhm.
And that's the wrong story to be telling.
I like that. Careful conversations. That was well said.
Mm,
I also felt like everything you just said there can enhance our empathy for what we go through as women, right? Especially noting that if you are experiencing a really tough menopause transition, and you are struggling, there is a lot going on. Maybe you're looking at Sally from the
yeah.
office and she's doing just fine, but maybe your home life is not great, or maybe you are in an area that's war torn right now and the stress is just impacting. I just love that there's a
Mm,
lot more going on than just
yeah.
than what meets the eye,
Yeah.
and I think that's important to have empathy for
Yeah.
oneself if you're in the middle of that.
Yeah. And I think we tend to more easily accept a variety of experiences during pregnancies. And almost, I suppose, if you've had more than one pregnancy, often, your pregnancies are so vastly different that you've got that internal anecdotal evidence to draw from, and to accept that someone can have, like, such severe morning sickness they can't get out of bed for 6 months or even 9 months. And you might have that, and then the next pregnancy might be fine, and you feel as
Yeah.
great as you've ever felt. And that's okay. Um, we need to perhaps be more accepting of that variety of experiences we have. And it's really interesting because with the focus is always on hormones, and I start to feel like it's a bit like Lady Macbeth, like out damn spot out. It's like that's the only thing we're going to look at. Um, I don't know where the Macbeth reference came from. One of my boys is studying Macbeth. Maybe that's why that's in my mind. I've got teenage sons. Um, is when we look at women who are what we might call hormonally sensitive, I think that there is a cohort of women from puberty onwards at these sort of inflection points, these reproductive life transitions. We see those women often being more vulnerable to these
Yeah.
shifts of hormones, and we don't
Yeah.
know what's underlying that. It's not the levels of hormones. Women who
Okay.
are experience depression at puberty, say, have PMS or PMDD, experience perinatal depression, experience mental health problems during perimenopause. It's not the levels of their hormones are like really high or really low. It's something underpinning that we don't quite understand
Mhm.
yet, that there's sensitivity to what would be a completely normal shift in someone else. So we might see identical hormone levels in some women, and they may feel like the ups and downs across the course of the month are like an absolute roller coaster. They're riding a hormonal roller coaster, whereas other women might not even notice. They might just they're just like every month happens, and they just carry on. So we need to, I think, take the respect that we have at different points in the lifespan and move that through to menopause. And I think it's really important when someone has a good experience or a healthy, like what went right. It's not to say you did it right and you've done it wrong, but I think that that is an interesting data point too. Like, what can we learn? We can't only learn by studying dysfunction. We've also got to learn to study what happens when things go right. Like, that's going to give us some data as well to make meaning of, to support women going forwards.
How much of it is our response to what's happening to us, like our own psychological response?
Well, I
Like,
think,
do we
yeah,
suffer from things that happen to us, or do we cope, like, or do we
yeah,
show others that we're suffering, right? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, how much of it is
100%.
controlled
I
by
think
ourselves?
that's that top down component, which will differ for everyone, and that might come. Maybe we could call that like, what's your kind of emotion
Coping? That's what it
regulation
is.
skills, or
Yes.
what's in your
Reactivity.
psychological toolkit. And
Yes.
sometimes your psychological toolkit involves other people.
Yeah.
And that will differ for different women at different points in the lifespan. You've got different psychological tools to draw from at different points in time. And sometimes it's a new story to tell ourselves, but sometimes it's hormone therapy, or sometimes it's, getting years of poor sleep under control, or sometimes it's starting to exercise every day and move every day. Sometimes it's completely changing your diet. Maybe you're an alcoholic. Maybe you haven't got a good social support network. Like, it can be all of those things, and that's why I always try and come back to my model to remind people that the brain is making meaning of all of those.
Hmm.
It's not highlighting one and ignoring the others. It's not just the one that's the loudest voice on social media. It's the brain is trying to make meaning of it all.
Hmm.
And we've got lots of levers that we can pull.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about stress a little bit. I heard you say that you don't really love the phrase fight or flight, and
Mm,
you like looking at that a bit differently when it comes to our reactivity towards stressful or events or stressors. So let's
mm.
talk about that.
Yeah, I don't like the words fight or flight.
Yeah.
So when we've got like in our body, we've got multiple stress response systems, and there's a paper I like to kind of refer to that calls it a neuro symphony of stress, an orchestrated neuro symphony of stress, because we're not lizards. We haven't just got like kind of one basic response where everyone on the planet will respond in an identical way to a particular stressor. And we've got within our body, we've got our autonomic stress response system, which has kind of two branches, which kind of work in synchrony, or like a seesaw, or like two dials. They kind of work together. They're not switches that one flicks on and the other flicks off. So we've got our sympathetic nervous system and our parasympathetic nervous system, and they're working in harmony across every heartbeat that we have. But we tend to use shorthand phrases to describe the sympathetic nervous system. That's our fight or flight system. And then it's kind of opposite, as if it's a switch that switches one way or another, is our parasympathetic nervous system. And sometimes that gets called rest and digest.
Hmm.
And those two functions, fight and flight and rest and digest, are roles that those two branches play, but almost when they are at their most extreme ends. And the reason I don't like that is because the sympathetic nervous system is kind of dialing up and down, as I said, across each heartbeat and each breath, and throughout the course of the day to mobilize and allow our body to kind of adapt and react and respond, and then kind of almost come back to baseline. And it's constantly shifting. I don't like the word fight or flight because that gives the impression that the only reason it is ever active or
Mm.
activated is when we are in fight or flight. And
Mm.
that
Okay.
means then we're kind of teaching people that say if your heart rate starts to increase, you're in fight or flight, and that's because you were once chased by a saber-toothed tiger, and therefore your body and brain are in threat response, as if there's only one reason for that system to be activated. And
Hmm.
so I don't like that language being used to describe, the example I often give is if I'm about to stand up, my heart rate will rise, start to increase, and increase my blood pressure slightly in advance of me standing up, because we don't want our blood pressure to drop so much that we faint when we stand up. And that is partly due to our sympathetic nervous system activating and making our heart rate increase. It's not gone into fight or flight.
Hmm. Yeah.
You haven't gone into fight or flight mode. You've just increased your heart rate slightly. So that's why I don't like that language, because I think it uses extreme language to describe just physiological functions which happen all of the time. I also, and then kind of attached to that is this word stress. I don't like that word either,
Okay. Tell us
because
why.
the neuroscientist in me, I like to be very clear and precise so we can describe what is happening in our bodies and our brains in response to things. And we use one word to describe stress as if the thing that's happening in the world to us, or in our mind to us, to activate a stress response, and then we feel stress.
Hmm.
So there we've kind of confused almost like the threat challenge, and I like to say threat, challenge, or opportunity, like what has happened out there in the world or in our mind, in the short term or in the long term. It happens, kind of, it could be a millisecond, it could be a clap of thunder and lightning, or it could be grief.
Hmm.
So we've gone from milliseconds to years there.
Hmm.
There's a stressor or a threat, challenge, and opportunity. And then we have this orchestrated neurosymphony of responses, brain and body physiological responses. Some are immediate, some are slow. And then we've got the kind of conscious perception of what is happening in our body and brain in response to the thing, the threat, challenge, or opportunity. And if we just use the word stress again, it's kind of a little bit of like that, the Brené Brown Atlas of the Heart, or emotional literacy. If we've only got one word to describe a whole host of responses, we've only almost got one message to our brain telling us what to do next.
Right.
And
For
if we
sure.
use a broader vocab for all of these three components, we open up different conversations and different ways of thinking about what's going on, instead of just saying stress. It's like,
Yeah.
let's get rid of it. Get rid of what?
Right.
The thing that's happened to us, our perception, the physiological response.
Well,
So it's
and
just a bit of a nerdy kind of frustration of mine. That means
yeah,
I like to use better language so we can do better psychoeducation. I can teach more
yeah.
clearly what's
I
happening.
I like that way better because, as you said, the so threat and what was the middle one?
Threat, challenge, or
Challenge. So
opportunity.
the challenge and the opportunity, both of those sound like they could be very positive, right? To
And
my
it could be
brain.
this, yeah, it could be the same stimulus. Like you
Right.
think about a barking dog. Like to
Yeah.
some people, that could be absolutely petrifying. You could
Right.
be a dog trainer and you're
Yeah.
like, I'm going to fix
Yeah.
that dog. Or, maybe you're a farmer and that's your sheepdog going to herd the sheep.
Yeah.
It's the same thing,
Yeah.
but who you are will, depend on what you perceive that as.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I like that language better. I'm going
Mm,
to start to use that. That's good.
good,
Let's
good.
talk.
My
Your work is
work is
done.
nearly
Yeah.
done.
Great. No, it's good. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about, just before we close here, about dementia and Alzheimer's. I visited my mother-in-law last week in a long-term care
Mm,
home, and she's late stage dementia, and she just sat there rocking, and it's very heart-wrenching, right? As we see it happening, we of course know it's there. We probably all know someone who has it, and we want to do everything we can to prevent it. I know menopause hormone therapy is not indicated for the prevention of dementia at this point, but are there things that we can do to help ensure that our brain is getting the optimal
mm,
health right now, so that we have our best chance
mm,
of not developing that?
mm. Yeah, well, firstly, I'm sorry to hear about your mother-in-law, and that's, I
That's
think, a
hard.
very common experience that lots of people listening will resonate with. Luckily, I haven't got to that point
Um,
yet. So,
yeah.
but it's a pretty common experience, and it's very confronting because it, happens over a long period of time, and none of us want to see ourselves in that situation. We
No.
ideally, I always think, want to live like, the late Queen Elizabeth did, work up until the day before we die, and then that's it.
Yeah.
That's my way to, nearly,
Oh, totally.
in my late 90s, work until the day I die, and then I'll be
Yeah.
done. That would be the ideal sort of scenario. And also, I appreciate you saying we know menopause hormone therapy is not indicated for dementia, both by the dementia societies and Alzheimer's disease, kind of research cohorts that are always looking at this, because wouldn't it be great if it was?
Yeah, for sure.
It would be, it's not a conspiracy. It would, if it was as simple as that, it would be recommended. It's not recommended by them, and it's not recommended by the menopause societies as a kind of as a preventative. And that's disappointing news and perhaps confusing news, because we also, have what appears at the face of it conflicting information about estrogen and sex hormones being great for our brains and our brain health, and they are. And then women being, more at risk of going on to develop Alzheimer's disease and other related dementias later in life compared to men. But plenty of men also do, and plenty of women also don't. So it's not just as simple as menopause is the funnel to get there, and
Right.
that the decline begins then. I think it's, again, coming back to my model, just to bore everyone, there are lots of different pieces in this. There are lots of what we might call risk factors. And one way to think about risk factors, I often think, is those old-fashioned sort of scales on a balance. And we've got factors which we know are very strong risk factors for, ending up going down that pathway. And we can, kind of put those weights on one side. And then we've got other factors which we know are protective, and we can kind of help balance that. And we don't know yet where to put the menopause hormone therapy,
Okay.
because at the moment there's a couple of weights on either side based on the current data that we've got right
Sure.
now. So we'll just take them off, because we don't know which side they're going to end up on one way or another yet. And just, I'm okay sitting with that. And I am 50 and I use menopause hormone therapy, because when I came off the pill about a year ago, about 10 days later, I started waking up with night sweats. It was like the
Right.
pill was like, you know, touched the sides. I just didn't even know what was going on. It was
Right.
great. And then I came off that. So I'm not, but I'm not using it to prevent dementia, because I'm not entirely sure whether it will or not.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so that's the point where we're at, but we do know what are some of those weights on those scales. And this comes back to, what do we know about what we can do to help ourselves biologically, socially, from the outside in world, and then mentally. And every few years, the Lancet publishes this sort of Alzheimer's review, and we've had that come out. I write about it in this in my book here. It last came out 2024, I believe. Um, and it's somewhere in the, off the top of my head, I was going to look it up. I believe it might be around 43 to 45% of cases of Alzheimer's disease, and this is globally, keep in mind globally, could be prevented with various modifiable interventions. Now, not every person is responsible for all of those interventions, because one of those is air pollution. And some people live in parts of the world where you can't like just decide to have clear air.
Right.
Like, it's not like a personal lifestyle choice here.
Right.
Another one is early life education. And if you're in your 80s, well, you can't do a lot about that. But we do know about 5% of cases globally could be prevented with longer early life education, because we know, having an enriched environment when you are young is very important. But that's still incredibly relevant for many parts of the world, where particularly girls don't always have the same access to education and then employment opportunities that boys do, depending on where in the world they are. Then we can move through to midlife, and I think perhaps the most surprising and least sexy and least discussed risk factor that we understand in midlife is hearing loss.
Yes.
At the
Right.
current report, put that at about 7% of cases globally. I mean, that's getting up to like 1 in 12, 1 in 10 cases, if my maths is right. Not 1 in
Wow.
10, but just, maybe 1 in 12. That's like crazy amounts.
Yeah.
And
Is
midlife
that because,
hearing loss is just so unsexy.
yeah, I was going to say, is that because the brain just stops working, stops hearing? Is that the mechanism
Yeah.
that's happening
Oh,
there?
well, we don't exactly know. We know it's untreated hearing loss. So if there's
Okay.
interventions in terms of hearing aids or preventing more hearing loss. Perhaps you've got industrial related hearing loss, or you're a rock star, or
Yeah.
you're always mowing lawns or whatever, listening to loud music. That kind of ongoing damage, prevent that, plus give people hearing aids. I mean, that's an
Okay.
oversimplified
Yeah.
answer there, but we know, because if you can't hear, you sort of shut down from the world. That's
Yeah.
one of your whole senses gone. You're not interacting with the world. you're not staying cognitively stimulated and engaged and socially integrated into the world around you. So that's a very, very strong risk factor. And then later in life, we see the same with vision loss. So people who can't see in the same way, again, they've lost, all of that outside in signaling. They can't see other people's faces, they can't interact, they can't read, they can't watch TV. And you combine that with hearing loss, you've got like, an enormous proportion there of cases simply by loss of these basic senses. And we never talk about that.
Yeah.
And so that's really important. And then a large kind of cluster of risk factors can almost fall under how we can intervene with exercise and diet and kind of overall lifestyle, because we know there's things like, your cholesterol levels and your high blood pressures and your diabetes risk and your cardiovascular risk. All of those kind of cardiovascular metabolic kind of disorders that people can start to develop in midlife, that we can intervene with lifestyle interventions and with medication if necessary. So kind of managing all of them, because if we have those issues embedded, we have poor cardiovascular health, we have poor metabolic health, we have high levels of inflammation, and all of these, it's almost like this triple whammy in the brain. And I'll just say a word briefly about cardiovascular health, because we tend to think about it only being about the heart and a heart attack. But the second part of that is vascular health. And if we think about our brain, it has this absolutely intricate network of fine blood vessels and capillaries. And that's how come we can get cool brain imaging, because we're essentially looking at changes in blood flow a lot of the time, in those beautiful rainbow colored images you see of brains. And we're able to get that precision because of the delicate, microvasculature of the brain. And we want to keep our microvasculature healthy. It's not just heart health, it's blood vessel health. And so that's, health of our retina, health of our kidneys, health of our fingers and toes, all of those organs and peripheral kind of parts of our body that rely on good, healthy blood flow, not just the big blood vessels going around your heart. So that's, a sort of a summary of all of that. And if we can kind of intervene in a lot of these kind of risk factors, we can add more weights to the, the protection side and remove some weights from the risk side, we might be able to tip the scales in our favor. But then underlying that, we've got factors that we can't necessarily do a lot about. So we've got biological sex still sitting there, but the experiences that we have as girls and women, what I would call gendered experiences in the world, may not necessarily be to do with hormones, but may be a risk factor in there. That we could talk about, like enriched life experiences, poverty, access to opportunity, access to healthcare, etc. And then we've got our baseline genetic risk that each of us will carry, kind of either a more or less of a risk or more or less of a kind of a protective factor for. We can't necessarily do anything about that either.
Right. And yet, like from just hearing you say all those things, it feels encouraging to me, because there is a lot that you can do. There's a lot of levers that you can pull and start moving toward optimizing your health. And, generally, what is it ever too late? Like once someone has been classified with dementia, are there things that you can do if you, have been, that you can, slow it down?
Yeah, there are. There's some programs are showing some success, but typically they're like, let's kind of throw everything in the kitchen sink at these people type interventions, which require a lot of money and a lot of financial support. So how useful I'll be globally or as broad scale public health interventions, they're going to require a lot. So it's never just as simple as, oh, we'll do more Sudoku or do online brain training or improve your diet. Or there's been drug trials which show some success, and then they tend to have also risks that come with them, medications to intervene, weight programs. A lot of individual programs have looked at a lot of these individual interventions and might see like tiny little improvements, particularly if someone's at earlier stage mild cognitive impairment, where they're not in a nursing home, but maybe they're sort of starting to see some changes. And there are interventions that we can do, perhaps not necessarily to always reverse it back, but maybe to slow that decline and intervene, and the earlier the better. And that's why it is really important. I mean, we're all petrified of this, and
Yeah.
especially when you're going through perimenopause and menopause, if you start having trouble with
Yeah.
finding
Brain
names
fog.
and, just like the total blanks that you draw. Like
Mhm.
sometimes I've just had later, and it's always about it's often for me it's names. Like I just picture someone in my mind. I'm like just like total blank. Like it's just not even there. The name, it's not even bubbling to surface. It's just blank.
Yep.
And
I
then it
feel
will
that.
eventually, and that's only been in, let me tell you, it's the last year or so. I
Yeah.
never, up until a year ago, I never noticed a thing. So let's just say that menopause hormone therapy hasn't necessarily dialed that down.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm not too concerned because I don't
Yeah.
believe I have mild cognitive impairment. But if
Yeah.
it does start to interfere with your everyday life, then go and get assessed. There
Sure.
are, there are, that's kind of what we've got healthcare systems for, more or less well funded and accessible in different parts of
Hmm.
the world, where you can go and kind of get yourself assessed and figure out whether you're just concerned about something that you don't need to worry about, or perhaps we do need to start looking at a host of interventions. But I mean,
Hmm.
it always makes me sad when I say that, because we haven't all got the money or the resources or the wherewithal
I
to
know.
just do that. We don't
Yeah.
all live somewhere where there's like, I live in
Yeah.
Sydney, Australia. Like,
Yeah.
I just have the most abundant amount of resources and the means to
Sure.
be able to access it. That doesn't mean that anyone else has what I have. And so it
Yeah.
makes me sad. That's why I don't even like the word lifestyle interventions, because it just assumes that if you don't do it, you're somehow morally inferior and can't do,
Hmm.
can't kind of cut it. And that's
Hmm.
just unfair, and doesn't address the broader socioeconomic kind of impact
Yeah.
of lack of access to these things. So I always feel a bit guilty when I kind of tell these stories, because, or
Hmm.
make these recommendations, because it doesn't mean everyone can just do it.
Hmm. Well, thank you so much for your time today and for being my guest. This was very enlightening, and I definitely want to go back and re-listen to a lot of the things that you said. There was so much, and I'm sure my audience will
Yeah.
agree with me that there was a lot of great information in today's session. So thank you so
Yeah,
much for
yeah,
being
yeah.
here.
Apologies for my long-winded explanations at times.
No,
I need to practice
that's
being shorter.
yeah, but you paint a picture for that's what I felt. It was you paint the picture, and then in my mind's eye, I can see top down, top up. Like that gives me the ability to retain that information. I think it was great.
Mm.
So thank you for that.
Oh,
Where can
thank you for
people
the
follow
invitation to
you?
chat.
Let's talk about your books. Just highlight your books here for us so people can
Yeah,
buy them.
well,
You.
today it's actually a great day today, because this is the second edition I have written of the Women's Brain book. As I said, the first one I wrote sort of 2016, 17, and now like so much has changed. So
Yeah,
I rewrote it. I've given
excellent.
it a comprehensive update. And today, literally as we are speaking now, the 25th of June in Australia, it's back on the shelves, second edition
Oh, perfect.
publication day. Just like happened this morning.
Congrats.
So I am very excited about this being out in the world. And that's, I've like done loads of reels, and I say on the back, women's brain health is no longer a niche.
Yeah,
It's
awesome.
not. And I I try and just want to talk about things in a different way, because I
Mhm.
try not to just focus on like starting from the point of the fact that our brains are broken. And then the other book that also came out this year, because somehow I wrote two books last year, and I turned 50 this year and I've published two books, which makes me look far more busy than I actually am, because this year I'm just flopping about at home with the dog, going for walks, and having too many parties with my friends.
It sounds like you deserve that though.
Yeah, I'm having a good year
Yeah,
celebrating 50. I wrote Brain Health for Dummies as well, which is the famous For Dummies brand. You could pick up Excel for
wonderful.
Dummies, you could pick up Brain Health for Dummies. And I have been teaching my neuroscience courses for 10 years now, and this book is dedicated to my students whose questions have like
Oh, neat.
set me down the
Informed
path,
that.
like have informed what's important and what
Yeah.
matters. And
Mhm.
it's written in the For Dummies style. It's kind of meant to be a little bit light-hearted and
Sure.
funny, and it's full of like what my boys would call dad jokes, mum jokes,
Sounds like
just
a
kind of
little
looking at
easier
yeah,
reading than the other one, maybe a little easier.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I
More
mean, I
interactive.
like to think that both of them are written in the same way that I speak, which is, and also like not too, let's not be too pious and serious about health. But the
Yeah.
last two chapters of the Dummies book 10 ways to hurt your happy, healthy brain. Get ready to roll your eyes so hard you'll see your own brain. And it's got tips like never get enough sleep, become a hermit, eat junk food. You can download those final 2 chapters if you go through to my website. You can download them for free. And then, and the women's brain book comes out on I talk about it on Reels, and I teach courses based on it. And so there's lots of ways people can enter my world of women's brain health. DrSarahMcKay.com, or McKay, as they say in North America. Come and say hi.
And Instagram, it's Dr. Sarah McKay.
McKay. M-C-K-A-Y.
Okay. I did introduce it as McKay, so okay.
That's fine. Yeah, lots of...
You're used to it.
The Scottish way, yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you everyone for listening today. As always, go move daily now in your fitness, wellness, nutrition, and in your brain health. And we'll see you all in the next Move Daily Talks.